Alright, today we've got 10 shop stories. And I'm going to see if I can whip through these quick enough so that you won't lose interest and bail out 10 minutes in. But I don't think it's going to take me that long to go through these, although I do have some stories to tell. Here's the outline. We got a Dodge Caravan, an engine vibration, running hot in traffic, a Ford van, a Crown Vicky, another Dodge Caravan, an overheater, a Trailblazer, a blank check, and a piston question. So let's jump in. This one had an erratic screwball shift pattern. It wasn't slipping, didn't shift gears consistently either, and some of the shifts were erratic and delayed, but sometimes it would shift just fine. You couldn't really recognize a pattern. And so this lady, she worked there at the college, and she had to drive her husband to 100 miles away to a bigger town to get some treatments done, like once a month or twice a month or something like that. But anyway, she made frequent trips up there, and this was troubling her. Well, she took it to a local transmission shop to start with, and the transmission shop guy said that maybe you have a new radiator installed because you got water in the fluid. So I says, okay, radiator, cooler in there, radiator. Well, maybe that sounds feasible. You know, that's all they did. They didn't like to do any work on anything except Chevys and Fords, and they did very little work on Dodges or any of that. These guys were really good transmission people on Chevys and Fords. They didn't really like Dodges or any other make. So she brought it over here, and sure enough, there was milky pink fluid. There was a little bit of water in there. It wasn't just, you know, dreadfully bad, but whenever the fluid looks like that, you got water in there. But replacing the radiator was pointless because this particular one came with a external transmission cooler. It wasn't leaking or anything, so it wasn't in the radiator. So there's no point in putting a radiator in there if the cooler's outside the radiator. And that's the way this one was built. So, well, maybe he had driven through some high water, and maybe the water came in through the transmission vent or something like that. Other than having it poured down the dipstick tube, I don't know what the deal was. And I said, well, this isn't a van with a lot of miles on it. Why don't we go ahead, before we get into it too deep or spend too much money on it, let's just go ahead and do we got a 700 code, whatever, and we did a fluid exchange, full fluid exchange, and we replaced the solenoid pack. That little thing cost about $150 at a parts store, but you got to have the right one. They're not all just alike, and so you can't just take one of these that kind of looks like it and pop it on there, because these passages and everything else are different. And so you got to be careful to make sure you get the right one for that specific transmission. Well, we did that. When we did the way we did the fluid exchange, we use this machine here, and then we would get what you do is you'd put new fluid in the new fluid tank, and then you'd have a dirty fluid tank, and you'd hook it up between the cooler and the transmission, and then you'd run the engine. You had to keep the pressure up, you know, giving it a little gas. And it would actually take the fluid that was going into it and put it in the dirty tank, and it would draw the fresh fluid out of here. It takes a lot of fluid to do this. After we got through, we went ahead and dropped the pan and did a regular fluid flush fluid and filter change like we ordinarily would. All right, so she drove that thing, and it took care of it. There was a little bit of glitter in the pan and some fine fuzz on the magnet. That's not so terribly unusual on a transmission with a lot of miles on it, and this one had 150K. Alright, so after we replaced the transmission fluid, the filter, everything was fine. It shifted great. And she was driving it to that big town up the road once or twice a month or whatever it was. And every report that I got from her was that it's doing great. I got no problem with it. All this issue is gone. Well, I had actually put this in Motor Age, wrote it in an article, and some transmission expert sent a really nasty email, you know, because my email address was at the bottom of those articles, and he was saying, you need to, you know, always, if you've even got a teaspoon of water in that transmission, you need to totally rebuild it from one end to the other, and you didn't do this job right. And so I wrote him back, and I said, this was like months later, I mean like 4 months later by the time it got into the magazine. And I says, this van has been running just fine for, you know, and she's been driving it several hundred miles a week, or a month rather. You know, actually probably 1,200–1,500 miles a month. Now, says she's never complained another time about it, says it's doing just fine. The proof's in the pudding. If it's fixed, then nobody can tell you you didn't do it right. You understand what I'm saying? Besides, it had 150,000 miles on it. She knew going in that we may have to rebuild it, but as it turned out, it was fine. Alright, we got an engine vibration. A little car came in with an NVH concern. The customer could feel the engine shaking when it was idling. Couldn't used to feel that. We found this rock wedged in the motor mount. You know, you wouldn't ever think of looking for something like that, but when we got that rock out of there, it was smooth as silk. Wasn't really anything wrong with the motor mount, but you could see that rock in there. So we had to pry that rock out of there. I don't know exactly how it got in there, unless she was torqued and threw some gravel up in there somehow with the tire. I don't know how that happened. Running hot in traffic. Another vehicle came in with running hot in traffic. We tested the fan at the relay socket, and it seemed like the fan was wide open, like there was no continuity at all. Unplugged the connector, and we see this right here. Well, needless to say, it had to have a fan and a connector, because you know you can't just replace the connector and have that old squirts terminal in the fan not drop voltage. And so we went ahead and did the whole thing, and that was the way that worked. Well, we had this van, this high mileage Ford 15 passenger van. It didn't quite drive right. The customer said it was all over the road. And that's the way they described it. A lot of times these people say, it's funny how customers have the same way of saying things in this part of the country. Whenever you think you fixed one, and you know, you've done everything you knew to do what, and for some reason you didn't never duplicate their concern, and you did what you thought might fix it, and they would come back still having had the concern. And around here, I don't know what they say where you're from, but around here they come back and they say, it's just like it was, it's just like it was. Those are exact words that they say. It's just so funny to me. But anyway, we have to go back. This is all over the road. Let me see what's going on. So I analyzed what had been done. You might notice, if you look carefully, there was brand new tires on the back, and they just put two new tires on the back. Nothing wrong with putting 2 new tires on the back, except in this case, those tires were really soft for some reason or another, and they didn't have the kind of road contact the front ones had. Even with you get 80 psi in the rear and 50 in the front. So we moved the hard old tires to the rear, because they still had really good tread on them. It seemed to make the van drive a whole lot better. But what do you do in a situation like that when you buy tires that are too soft and they make it wobble around? Because this heavy van was top heavy, especially when you're hauling people in it. It needs some good firm tires with a lot of road contact for the tread and all that, you know. But anyway, the long and the short of it was swapping the tires around seemed to take care of that one. Alright, so this 2002 Crown Vicky was another one all over the road. That's what they said. And we'd repaired a brake squeak a couple of weeks earlier on this one, but we hadn't noticed any all over the road issues on that visit. However, this was pretty interesting too. We had tight ball joints. I could kind of tell the front end was a little tight. The steering almost wouldn't return to center unless you helped it. Now the reason it returns to center anyway is because of caster settings, because when you turn the wheels to the left and the right, unless you're right in the center, it picks the car up a little bit, you see, and that makes it want to go to the lowest spot. That's why it centers anyway. This one in particular, it didn't really want to center, so what I did here, I said, well, let's go ahead and get this thing jacked up, and let's take the tie rod ends loose where we can actually move this. And whenever you took the tie rod ends loose, the ball joints on both sides were really, really stiff. Even though the boots were still good, the joints were dry for some reason, and we replaced the ball joints and we got it all limbered up again, and that's all it needed. See, if you take that tie rod end off and you grab this, it ought to move just real freely, you know, like door hinges. And on this one here, it wasn't doing that. All right, here's another 2005 Caravan. Had a rattling noise coming from the belt area. Now, we were looking at this thing with the hood up, just looking down in there, you know, duh, we should have known better. But anyway, here we were. I said, well, this overrunning pulleys, I've seen those overrunning pulleys do this. And so I says, I wanted to condemn that because we had run into that before, making alarming noises. And that's the overrunning pulley. You know, it even comes with a little hex thing that you can, it's like a 17 millimeter, that you can put slide that hex in there and put a socket on it. It's like a little piece of an Allen wrench about, you know, that long or something. you pop a little plastic cover off of it, and then you spin this off there with the impact wrench, and you put another one on there, because this pulley's got some stuff inside of it. So what's in there? We got some, there's 2 or 3 different ways they're made. This particular one was made with a spring. Now this is not the pulley off that one, but it's a different one we had. And so I cut this thing open so that you could see what was in it. It's got these springs. You know how a spring is, when you turn it one way it gets looser, when you turn it the other way it tightens up. That's what this overrunning pulley thing's all about. And so this one here is special for that reason. This is one right here, a different one that came all to pieces on the inside, and it was making a lot of racket. And so they make strange noises, and you'll usually see rust and stuff on the alternator right behind the pulley when one comes apart as bad as this one did. Alright, the pulley wasn't the problem. I felt the relationship between the pulley and its hub. You can tell usually by feeling of these things, if that's what the deal is. The pulley's 70 bucks. You know, which is cheaper than an alternator. There's no use in replacing a whole alternator because of a noisy pulley. But in this one here, I said, I don't think the pulley's what's wrong with this one. So we figured we're going to raise this thing up. So we took it, we had it on the ground, looking at the thing, didn't even raise it up and look underneath it, you know, because you can't see everything. Well, you see this right here? There's 3 ears. There's an ear here, an ear here, and an ear here, and that one had broke. Right there, see how it's bolted in there? And this, they got this pulley fixed because of the spaces under there where you can unbolt that pulley and you can turn it like 120 degrees and then bring it off, you know, or past that, whatever. Anyway, that's the way it's fixed on those water pumps on those caravans and everything. But that ear on that pump hub had broke off, and that's what was making that racket on that one. So we had to put a water pump on it, big deal, whatever. Now, observe and think. Pay attention when you got an overheating problem. As one mechanic noticed the movement of dust on the ground and figured out that the fan was pushing air into the radiator instead of pulling air through it. That usually happens when somebody puts one of those universal fans on there and they just hook the wires up any kind of way, and because the fan runs they think it's okay. But if you could put a piece of paper up against it when that fan's running, it ought to pull it against. I'm talking about in the front of the condenser. It ought to pull that paper against it, or just put it up in front of the grill if it's close enough. And that thing, well, it ought to pull that air in. If it's blowing while you're driving down the road, it's going to cause the motor to overheat. And it won't just overheat when it's sitting still either. It'll overheat at other times. So make sure if somebody puts a fan on there that was, you know, this is particularly suspect when they've actually cut the wires and spliced them back together. You know, because a lot of people do that. They'll cut both wires and they say, oh no, I don't know which one goes where. And then they think, well, if the fan runs, it's okay. But this one mechanic was that I had over there, I was training. He said, look at the way that dust is going under there on the floor. We hadn't swept the floor in a week, but there it was, you know. And he figured it out that way. When we swapped those fans around, all that overheating problem went away. Don't overthink it and put head gaskets and thermostats on if somebody just had the fan wired backwards, okay? Alright, so this is an easy one. A math student came in there. I was there by myself doing paperwork. All the students were gone. And she came in and she said, hey, I drove over here just fine. My Trailblazer won't start. So I said, okay. I went out there and plugged in. I just spun it over, you know, you could turn it on and hear the fuel pump. So, well, the computer's awake. So I went out there and I plugged the scan tool in, and I got a crank sensor code. And I didn't get an RPM signal when I was spinning it over. And I said, well, let's start with a crank sensor. Called the parts house. They bought a $16 crank sensor over. She paid them cash when they got there. And I could stand there, I could stand right here by the fender and reach down there and plug it. I mean, it was kind of a stretch, but I reached down there and I changed out that crank sensor, flat-footed in the parking lot with it sitting on the ground. And that took care of that problem. Boom, fired up. Well, see, the thing about it is she had been burned before by other places. I don't know. I can't speak for those places or why she thought she'd been burned. Sometimes customers think they've been burned when they weren't. But she thought I was Superman because she said every time I've ever had anybody work on my car, they always charged me a whole lot of money, and I wasn't ever satisfied with their work. But she was pleasantly satisfied that she just paid 16 bucks. Remember, I was a college instructor. We didn't charge labor, and so she was a student, and I felt like I was just doing a little service there in the parking lot, you know. Sometimes we'd have students come over saying, hey, I've locked my keys in my car. Can you get them out? The cops got to where they wouldn't even come to the college anymore because they got too many calls. And I got one of that thing what you'd wedge in between there with a long rod, you know, with a vacuum cap on the end of it. We could get into it just about anybody's car. But what got me was when somebody would come over there asking, hey, can you get me in my car because I've locked my keys in it, I would always grill them. And I'd say, well, you don't let this happen again. Why'd you lock your keys in your car? Why don't you pay attention to what you're doing, you know? And even if it was a student I didn't even know. And they'd say, oh, yeah. They were always real humble. And I'd say, now, you know, we're probably going to tear the rubber on the door, and we may break the glass, and we're just going to make a mess, and your car won't never be the same again. You're going to have water leaks and wind noise and all this kind of stuff. Before I start, I need to tell you, you're going to have all kinds of issues. And they say, well, I don't care. Just get me into my car, you know. But when you have that plastic wedge, you know, you don't typically have that problem. You know, you just go to, you just get on in there and get the thing unlocked for them and send them on their way. This Expedition, this girl come over there, all you got to do on some of them older model Expeditions is you got a long screwdriver, you can reach in there by the outside door handle and get on that rod that unlocks it, just go whoop, pop it up. Doesn't take 3 seconds, you know. And I got in one girl's Expedition like that, and she was really happy, and I was thinking she ought to be really worried because it's too easy to get into an Expedition like that. Alright, so blank check. This one farmer came and he literally signed I'm not making this up. He signed a blank check and left it with the cashier. The service writer says, this guy gave us a blank check and said, fix my truck, you know, because it had a little skip. And so I says, well, you know, I had a tendency to surgically repair stuff and not charge very much, you know. And I've been there at the place long enough to where if I did a job that didn't, right there, that didn't take 15 or 20 minutes, I would just charge half an hour of labor and whatever the part was, you know, because I always like to see happy customers. The service writer liked to see happy customers. Service manager didn't have a problem with it. And so I put a bad plug wire, one plug wire, because at the Ford place you can get just one plug wire, or you used to could. I don't know, now they don't have plug wires anymore. But I put one plug wire on there that was the right length and all that, and routed it and everything, and took care of that skip. And it wasn't hard to find the skip. I sprayed soapy water on the wire, pop, 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 when I'm popping, you know. And then I tested over it and everything was fine. And he was happy with that. And I think his bill might have been, this is pretty good while back, I think it might have been $30 or $40 or something like that. And so he was just really happy about that. You don't want to violate the trust of somebody that is willing to hand you a blank check. As far as I know, we had never worked on this guy's vehicle before. And he just got his crops in. He had a lot of money in the bank, and he felt like whatever they charge me, I'll pay it. There was another time, this farmer friend of mine, I really liked the guy, old farmer friend. He came and he had a 91 Ford F-150 and he had 30,000 miles on it. And he says, I want you to take this truck to the Ford place and do a 30,000 mile service on it. This truck was 4-wheel drive. And I said, are you serious? Are you serious about me? Well, yeah, he says, take it to the Ford place and do whatever you have to do for 30,000 mile service. And I said, huh. Okay, I didn't know how much it was going to cost, but I knew it wasn't going to be cheap. And so we went over and we did, and I didn't do all the work. I mean, some of the other mechanics did the work and all because of the kind of work it was, and I was doing drivability and electronics. This thing, actually, whenever I got the bill, it was $550, but all the stuff you're supposed to do on a 4-wheel drive F-150 91 model at 30,000 miles is about $550 worth of work. And so he was in the kitchen with his wife, and I grew up knowing this guy, I mean, forevermore, and his son's my best friend. But anyway, I went over and I says, Charles, this truck here is, the bill's $550. He goes, what? You're kidding me. His wife just grabbed the checkbook, opened it up, wrote a check for $550 to the Ford place, and handed it to me, and I, you know, went and paid the bill with that the next day over there at the cashier. But that was really funny how he was actually kind of tight with his money, but he had money he had never seen. You know, that guy was he was really wealthy, but he didn't think it was going to cost $550, and I was kind of surprised myself. We didn't rip him off. Everything we charged for was by the book and all that, but there's a lot of stuff you got to do on a 4-wheel drive in 1991. But this guy right here with the blank check, he turned in one of the best customers we ever had. He kept coming back over there. Treat them right, they do that. What's wrong with this picture? What would you say if you took one? I used to see my dad. He would be working on a car that he would have the motors out of, pistons out of, and I'd say, what's wrong with this one here? And he would point to this. He goes, these ring gaps are stacked. Now, they don't move around after you put them on there. So the smart thing to do, or if they do, they're not going to move 180 degrees. Put this one on the other side of the piston, this one on this side of the piston. You don't typically have any issue. That's your oil control ring there. And so I said, well, blow by will be cause, I showed this to my students, if you put those in there with those ring gaps stacked, there's going to be a lot of blow by that's going right by those little ring end gaps whenever even when them rings are squeezed together. So those, Even if you look in your little paper that comes with your piston rings, you're going to see that it says to, you know, stagger those, put them on the opposite side and all that. Well, I rushed through these 10 jobs really fast. I hope you guys have a great week, and I hope you'll be careful out there, and I'll talk to you next week.